The cabin was unnervingly quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional squeak of luggage in the overhead compartments. Flight 437, a routine cross-country trip from Dallas to Seattle, was cruising at 36,000 feet, passengers mostly lost in movies, books, or the gentle nod of sleep. But among them sat Alina Harper, in seat 14C, a young woman whose presence was unremarkable to anyone glancing her way. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were alert, calculating, and slightly anxious, a subtle tension she wore like armor. No one could have guessed she carried a secret the crew would soon beg for. Minutes passed normally. The flight attendants walked the aisle, offering beverages and reassurances. Alina sipped her tea, eyes flicking to the cockpit occasionally, noting the subtle twitches of the captain and first officer, tiny signals that something was off. At first, she told herself she was imagining it. Pilots are professionals. They're trained to remain calm, but something in the rhythm of their voices over the intercom felt forced. It began with a soft alarm, a faint, barely audible beep over the PA. Passengers didn't notice, distracted by their screens or conversations, but Alina froze. She had heard this alarm before. In her own past life, she'd tried to bury deep inside herself. Military flight simulators, late nights at an FAA-approved training facility, hours of strict protocol under the watchful eyes of veteran instructors. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. Then the voice came over the intercom, calm but tinged with something unusual. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a technical issue. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The crew tried to keep the tone reassuring, but Alina caught the subtle tremor. Her heart began to beat faster, not out of panic but recognition. She knew the signs. She closed her eyes briefly and recalled the exact scenario she had trained for countless times: dual-engine failure at cruising altitude. The simulations always stressed one thing: if both engines quit, the captain has only minutes to glide, assess, and land safely. Hesitation was fatal. The first officer's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and clipped. "Fuel readings are dropping faster than expected. We might not make the nearest airport." The cabin didn't react. Most passengers had no idea, but Alina's hand gripped the armrest. She'd flown small private planes before, but never a commercial airliner, at least not officially. Her life had taken a different route after college. Civilian flight paths, corporate jobs, the expected trajectory of a young woman who wanted stability. But flying had never left her, and right now, deep inside, it was calling. A flight attendant walked past, smiling and reassuring, oblivious to the tension brewing in the cockpit. "Everything's fine," she said mechanically, though her own hands trembled as she pushed the cart forward. Alina didn't respond. She didn't need reassurance, she needed action. Then came the next alert, a staccato series of alarms, sharp and insistent. Every eye in the cabin turned upward, passengers now looking around with growing unease. Panic, subtle but spreading, began to seed itself. Phones were pulled from pockets, whispers started. In the cockpit, the captain muttered something under his breath, frustration and fear mixing in a way Alina recognized immediately. "Both engines," she murmured to herself. Her training, dormant for years, surged forward with unrelenting clarity. She knew exactly what those words meant. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, drinks spilled. A child in row 17 screamed. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm," the captain said, but the effort to sound calm was failing. Alina's eyes darted to the exit rows, calculating the glide, the weight distribution, even the wind currents. They were minor details, but details mattered in moments like these. Her heart pounded, but her mind was methodical. She had sat in 14C countless times, reading manuals, memorizing emergency procedures, imagining herself in impossible scenarios. Now it was real. And in that split second, she made a decision that would redefine everything. She stood slowly, feeling the eyes of nearby passengers on her, but she didn't flinch. The flight attendants noticed her movement, frowning. "Ma'am, please remain seated," one said, concern now clear in her voice. I think I can help, Elena said, voice firm. The cabin hushed slightly. A man in a business suit raised an eyebrow. A mother clutched her daughter closer. Her words sounded strange, even to her own ears. I know how to fly this plane. Laughter bubbled quietly from a few passengers, nervous and incredulous. A middle-aged man chuckled and muttered, "Yeah, sure, and I'm the president." But Elena ignored them, focusing instead on the subtle alarms still flashing above the cockpit. Inside, the pilots were already struggling. The captain was on the radio, speaking with ground control, but his words were clipped, professional, and shallowly calm. They hadn't realized, yet, that the gravity of the situation required more than protocol. The fuel was nearly gone. Seconds would count. Elena took a deep breath and approached the cockpit door. She hadn't had clearance in years. She knew she was technically trespassing, but moral clarity overrode legality. She pounded gently, then firmly. The first officer opened the door slightly, disbelief in his eyes. "Ma'am, you can't," he began, but the captain's voice suddenly cut in over the comm. "If you know what you're doing, we're listening." It was an invitation Elena didn't expect. Fear and hesitation flashed across the pilots' faces. They had trained for emergencies, but not for someone, an unknown passenger, claiming they could solve a problem they themselves were facing. Elena's mind raced. She ran through the sequence silently. Dual engines out, altitude, glide slope, weight, speed. She had memorized these for years, practiced them in simulators until muscle memory took over. And now, the real thing was waiting, every life on board balanced on her ability to act. A sudden jolt shook the plane again. Oxygen masks didn't drop yet, but tension rippled like electricity. The cabin held its collective breath. Elena could feel it. The point of no return was almost upon them. The captain, visibly shaken, turned to her. His voice was barely a whisper but firm. "We've got nothing left. No fuel. Engines dead. Are you sure?" Elena nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, I can do this. Let me fly." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Passengers watched, silent. Flight attendants froze, unsure whether to intervene or prepare for disaster. The crew exchanged worried glances. Could she really do it? A passenger, unknown, in seat 14C, claiming she could take control of a 737 mid-crisis. Then came the sound of the engine stuttering, a low, mechanical groan that sent chills down every spine. The plane tilted slightly as it began its descent. Panic flickered in the eyes of some passengers. Elena's jaw tightened. There was no time for doubt. She stepped into the cockpit, feeling the weight of every life on board pressing down on her shoulders. The controls were cold under her hands. She adjusted her grip, breathing in, focusing, compartmentalizing. Years of preparation had led to this impossible moment. And then, as she glanced at the altimeter, she realized the glide path wasn't just critical, it was unforgiving. One wrong calculation, one hesitation, and the plane would be lost. The captain exhaled sharply, stepping back. "It's all yours," he said. Elena's eyes flicked to the cabin briefly, where passengers now sensed the gravity of the situation. Phones were being dropped, children clung to their parents. The hum of fear was palpable, tangible. And then she looked back at the instruments. Both engines were dead. Every muscle in her body tensed. Every decision from this moment forward could mean life or death. She gripped the yoke, steeling herself for the impossible. The first part of Flight 437's story, once routine, now catastrophic, was over. The true test, the moment that would define her, had just begun. And in the cabin, a single thought spread quietly among the passengers. Who was this woman in 14C, and could she really save them all? Elena's fingers clenched the yoke with an iron grip, the cold metal grounding her as adrenaline surged through her veins. Every breath she took was deliberate, each thought precise. She had memorized emergency protocols, but memorization wasn't enough now. The plane was real, alive, and teetering on the edge of disaster. The cockpit smelled of heated plastic and fear. The captain hovered in the corner, his face pale, beads of sweat tracing his temples. The first officer, still in shock, muttered numbers under his breath, running calculations that only deepened Alina's focus. She needed altitude, glide path, speed, and control, all perfectly aligned. There was no room for hesitation. "Listen carefully," Alina said, voice calm but commanding, cutting through the thick tension. "I need you to talk to ATC. Tell them we're gliding. Prepare emergency landing instructions for a river. We don't have time for anything else." The captain's eyes widened. "A river," he said, disbelief cracking his professional veneer. "There's nothing." "No options left. We glide, we survive," Alina interrupted. Her tone brooked no argument. She flicked switches, monitored readings, and calculated descent angles with uncanny precision. It was like she was born for this impossible moment. Down below, the landscape blurred. The city lights of Seattle gleamed faintly through the night sky, distant yet tantalizing. Rivers snaked through darkened terrain. One in particular caught her eye, a wide, calm body of water stretching like a mirror beneath the moonlight. It would have to be the target. The calculations were tight, the margin for error non-existent, but it was possible. In the cabin, passengers had begun to sense the gravity of the situation. Whispers turned to murmurs of panic. A man in row 12 clenched his daughter's hand so tightly it turned white. Mothers clutched children, elderly passengers closed their eyes. Phones were held up, recording, documenting, some for proof, some for a final message. No one spoke. Everyone waited. The plane shuddered as it lost more altitude. The groan of the engines, fading into silence, was deafening. Alina adjusted the yoke, feeling the aircraft's unnatural glide, anticipating every lurch. She murmured under her breath the numbers she'd memorized from simulations. Descent rate, airspeed, angle of attack. Each calculation was a thread, weaving a fragile lifeline over the abyss below. The first officer finally broke the silence. "You really know what you're doing, don't you?" His voice trembled, a mixture of awe and fear. Alina didn't respond. Focus demanded full attention. The river's reflection grew larger in her view, stretching wider as the plane descended. Winds buffeted the fuselage, rocking it slightly, testing her control. She leaned into it, compensating, calculating minute adjustments with microsecond precision. She could hear the faint cries from the cabin, the gasps, the heartbeat of hundreds echoing through the airframe. The captain stepped forward cautiously. "If we make it, you'll be a legend," he said, voice tight. "If not, I don't even want to imagine." Alina shot him a glance, a flicker of grim humor passing her features. "I don't have time for legends. I have time for survivors." The cockpit instruments flickered ominously, the fuel gauge dead at empty, the altimeter dropping relentlessly. Her stomach clenched. Every decision, every second mattered more than it ever had in her life. She could almost feel the gravity pulling, the inevitable physics of a powerless aircraft. In the cabin, the flight attendants were now fully aware. Their training took over. They braced themselves, instructing passengers to stay seated, to lock their arms around children, to adopt positions that might save lives. Their eyes flicked toward the cockpit, wondering, questioning, terrified. But slowly a sense of hope began to bloom. The woman in 14C, unknown, untrained in this specific plane by law, was doing the impossible. Alina spotted a slight bend in the river, a natural curve that could serve as a gentle corridor for the landing. She calculated her angle, her speed, the altitude she needed to reach without overshooting or stalling. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her mind was razor-sharp, unblinking, unflinching. Suddenly, a loud jolt rocked the plane. Panic surged in the cabin. A soda can rolled across a tray table, rattling loudly. Alina's teeth clenched. That jolt had thrown off her calculations slightly, but she adapted instantly. Minor corrections, barely perceptible, were made with mechanical precision. Every second counted. She spoke to the crew in a low, steady tone. "Prepare for impact. Brace positions, clear the aisles, no one moves until I say. The captain, visibly shaken, muttered, "God, I hope we make it." The first officer's hands hovered over the throttle and controls, ready to assist, but Alina motioned him back. "Not yet. This is my glide. Let me do this." The river grew larger in view. Moonlight sparkled off its surface, deceptively calm. Below, trees and buildings raced past, shadows twisting unnaturally in the reflection of the lights. The aircraft descended faster than the eye could follow, but Alina's hands were steady, her calculations flawless. A passenger gasped audibly from row 20, clutching the armrest. Alina ignored the cabin sounds, hyper-focused. Her mind calculated wind resistance, weight distribution, even the minor turbulence created by the shifting air above the cityscape. Everything was a variable in a high-stakes equation. Suddenly, another jolt, stronger this time. The fuselage groaned in protest. Panic rippled through the cabin. Alina gritted her teeth, adjusting with micro-movements that felt almost instinctual. Sweat stung her eyes, but she did not blink. She glanced once more at the river ahead. Perfect. If she could maintain the angle and control, if nothing catastrophic occurred in the next 60 seconds, they had a chance. A real, tangible chance. The cockpit door rattled slightly. One of the flight attendants had come forward, her eyes wide. "We're ready," she said, voice shaking. "Passengers are braced. Whatever happens, you're our only hope." Alina's jaw tightened. She didn't need hope. She needed physics, skill, and nerve. But she acknowledged the words silently, letting the weight of responsibility fuel her focus. The plane tilted slightly to compensate for wind. Shadows of buildings flickered across the fuselage, riverbanks approaching. A branch of trees scraped dangerously close on one side. She corrected, micro-adjustments saving them all. Then, just as the river opened fully beneath them, a sharp, unexpected turbulence threw the plane into a terrifying side tilt. A cry echoed from the cabin. Alina's stomach lurched, but she maintained control, fighting the natural pull of gravity, fighting the instinct to panic. She knew what had to happen next. She whispered under her breath, "Glide, align, descend." Every second was precious. Every movement mattered. The river stretched wider now, calm and deceptively still. She could see the lights of small boats far below, glinting off the water. The glide path was perfect, but the question remained. Would they make it to the water intact, or would the turbulence, the missing engines, the sheer physics of a powerless jet destroy them all? And in the cabin, every passenger silently realized one horrifying truth. They were completely at her mercy. Alina's eyes scanned the instruments one last time, each dial and gauge screaming silent warnings she had to ignore. There was no fuel, no engine thrust, nothing but gravity, airspeed, and her skill guiding them now. The river beneath gleamed like liquid silver, deceptively serene, hiding the lethal consequences of one miscalculation. "Brace positions," she commanded, her voice calm, almost unnervingly so. Passengers gripped their armrests, children clutched parents, and the elderly shut their eyes. Flight attendants moved quickly, ensuring everyone was in position. There was no panic, just rigid, tense readiness. Every second was a fragile thread stretched over the abyss. The plane tilted dangerously, buffeted by sudden gusts of wind. Alina adjusted the yoke with micro-movements, each subtle push countering the violent forces threatening to topple the fuselage. The first officer's eyes were wide with disbelief, silently backing off, letting her take over. The captain muttered prayers under his breath, staring at the river as if willing it to remain perfectly flat. Alina could feel the plane's weight as it descended. Hundreds of souls rested on her instincts and training. The glide path was narrow. The margin for error had evaporated. She calculated angles, compensations, and descent rates with a speed her mind hadn't known in years. Every jolt of turbulence, every flicker of light on the instruments, every second of passing altitude was critical. The riverbank drew closer. Trees loomed on either side, a natural corridor that was both their savior and their threat. Elena adjusted her descent slightly, avoiding the taller clusters while keeping the plane's trajectory aligned with the water. Below, reflections of streetlights danced across the surface like warning beacons. In the cabin, a child in row 18 whimpered softly. Elena's mind flicked to the human cost, a sudden weight that grounded her focus further. She couldn't afford empathy to distract her. She couldn't hesitate. Every passenger, every child, every elderly face was tied to her ability to act flawlessly. "Steady, steady," she whispered under her breath. The plane's nose dipped slightly too low, and instinctively she corrected, feeling the aircraft's inertia respond, almost grudgingly. The wings flexed under the strain, metallic groans echoing in the cockpit. She ignored them. The sound was meaningless if survival was possible. The river widened beneath them, a mirror stretching endlessly, deceptively calm. The turbulence returned, sharper this time. A jolt rocked the fuselage, rattling passengers violently in their seats. A cup flew across a tray table, spilling soda on a sleeping man. Elena's jaw tightened. She had no time for distractions. Her eyes flicked to the altimeter. Too low, too fast. She made tiny, precise adjustments, keeping the plane in the narrow corridor of safety. The engines, though dead, left residual weight and drag. The aircraft felt heavier than life itself. Every microsecond mattered. The captain muttered, "You're incredible," though his voice trembled. Elena didn't respond. Focus consumed her. Every movement of the yoke, every pressure on the pedals, was a calculated counter to the deadly combination of physics and wind. The riverbank approached rapidly. Trees scraped the fuselage's lower panels with threatening proximity. Elena's breath was steady, her focus unyielding. She visualized the landing in her mind, every calculation rehearsed in simulations now coming alive. She could do this, but only if she remained perfect. The glide path narrowed further. The plane tilted slightly, threatening to touch the riverbank on one side. Elena's hands flew across the yoke, compensating. The fuselage groaned ominously. Below, the reflection of moonlight danced on the water, creating illusions that could trick even the sharpest eye. Passengers clutched each other, some silent, some whispering frantic prayers. Flight attendants held their ground, faces pale, hands trembling. Outside, the wind whipped against the fuselage, adding to the chaos of descending aircraft. The first officer finally spoke, almost inaudible. "If anyone can do this, it's you." Elena allowed herself a fleeting glance. His eyes were wide, filled with awe and terror. She didn't acknowledge him, not yet. The river spread beneath them, the final stretch of their glide. Elena adjusted throttle controls, even dead, to manipulate air resistance and balance. The wings dipped slightly. She countered with minute yoke movements. Every adjustment counted. One miscalculation and they wouldn't make it to the water alive. A loud jolt shook the cabin. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but a collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Elena's heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady. The reflection of the river's surface approached faster than any mind could comfortably track. Trees scraped closer. Metallic groans filled the cockpit. Elena's mind raced, calculating speed, descent, glide slope, and final touchdown point. The plane was still descending faster than desired. There was no room for error, no safety net, nothing but skill, instinct, and nerve. "Hold steady," she whispered. The wings flexed under pressure. Another gust of wind slammed into the fuselage, tilting it dangerously. Elena countered instantly. Below, the river stretched like liquid glass. She targeted a calm section, free from debris and obstacles. Passengers were silent, clutching whatever they could. One child screamed, muffled by a parent's embrace. Another whispered, "Mommy." Elena blocked out every sound but the plane, the instruments, and the river below. The first touch was imminent. She adjusted flaps, kept the angle precise, and prepared for the inevitable splashdown. The river surface was approaching faster than ever. Shadows of trees and buildings streaked past the fuselage. Alina braced herself, mentally prepared for impact. Then just as the plane's wheels, or what passed for them in this powerless glide, were about to meet the water, a sudden surge of wind threatened to tilt the aircraft sideways. Alina's hands flew instinctively, fighting the turbulence, balancing the plane on an almost impossible axis. The first officer gasped, She's going to do it." The plane touched the water fuselage first, a violent shudder running through the cabin. Panic surged briefly as water splashed against the windows. Alina maintained control, countering the river's uneven currents, keeping the plane from flipping. Every second, every movement mattered. Passengers screamed, gripping seats, bracing for disaster. Flight attendants shouted instructions over the chaos, but their voices barely penetrated the roar of impact. The plane skidded on the river, spraying water against windows, bouncing slightly as the glide carried them forward. Alina's mind stayed sharp, ignoring pain, fatigue, or fear. The river was their runway now. She adjusted subtly, compensating for minor currents, guiding the plane toward calmer waters, keeping it upright. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into mere seconds, the plane slowed, friction and water resistance taking over. It floated, intact, a miracle suspended on liquid silver. The cabin erupted in a mix of sobs, laughter, and disbelief. Passengers clutched each other, silent for a moment, stunned by survival. Alina slumped slightly in her seat, hands trembling yet still gripping the yoke. She allowed herself a single, deep breath. The captain finally spoke, voice hoarse, broken by emotion. I don't know what to say." Alina exhaled, still focused, still alert. "Stay seated. Don't move until instructed. We're not out of this yet." Below, rescue lights began to flicker along the riverbanks. Emergency crews had been alerted. Helicopters began circling. The realization of survival hit passengers slowly, each mind catching up to the impossibility they had just lived through. And in the cockpit, Alina finally allowed herself a glimpse of relief, but only a flicker. She had done the impossible, yes, but the aftermath was only beginning. Questions, investigations, astonishment awaited, and the world beyond the riverbanks had no idea of the woman in 14C who had saved them all. A child's voice broke the heavy silence. "Mommy, she's a hero." Alina's gaze softened, but only for a moment. She looked out at the water, the riverbanks, the emergency crews approaching. Survival had been achieved, but the story, the consequences, and the recognition of her actions were just beginning. The river stretched endlessly below, moonlight shimmering over its surface. The impossible had been done, but the next chapter, the reckoning and the world's reaction, waited. And no one, not even Alina, could predict what came next. The river was eerily calm now, the plane floating like a giant, wounded bird on the silver water. Emergency crews converged, their lights flickering across the fuselage as helicopters hovered overhead. Alina's hands slowly released the yoke, fingers trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, but her eyes never left the instruments. There was still work to do. This wasn't over. Not yet. In the cabin, silence reigned for a heartbeat before it erupted into chaotic relief. Passengers clung to each other, some weeping, some laughing through their sobs. The flight attendants moved swiftly, directing everyone, checking for injuries, their professional training returning in full force. It was a surreal scene. Terror had turned to astonishment, panic into cautious celebration. A young mother hugged her daughter tightly, whispering, we're alive because of her." The words floated through the cabin, a whispering thread connecting everyone. Alina felt a pang of humility, a flash of human warmth, but she suppressed it. She had done what had to be done. Emotional indulgence came later. The captain finally spoke, voice hoarse, hands shaking as he looked at her. "Ma'am, you saved all of us. I don't even know how to thank you." His words trembled with disbelief, awe, and raw emotion. He looked at the first officer, who could barely speak, nodding as if confirming the impossibility of what had just occurred. Alina's eyes softened, but only slightly. Everyone stay calm. Rescue teams are here. We follow instructions and we'll all get out safely. She pushed herself from the cockpit, moving down the aisle toward the passengers. Every eye followed her. Whispers began spreading, a mixture of gratitude and stunned disbelief. Who was this woman? How had she done the impossible? Outside, rescue boats began approaching, engines slicing through the river, their lights reflecting off the rippling surface. Firefighters, paramedics, and police swarmed, ropes and ladders deployed. Helicopters hovered closer, ready to lift passengers to safety if necessary. The scene was cinematic in every sense, a real-life action movie, unfolding under the night sky. Alina guided the crew, the passengers, and herself through the evacuation. Remain calm, single file. Use life vests if needed. Follow instructions, she instructed. There was no room for hesitation. Panic could undo everything. And yet, for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the weight of their trust. Hundreds of lives now hinged on her words, not just her skill. A man in row 14, trembling, finally found his voice. You flew the plane. How did you do it? Alina glanced at him, eyes steady. Training, experience, focus, that's all. Her voice was calm, almost understated, but the eyes of everyone around her burned with curiosity, awe, and disbelief. Outside, emergency crews reached the plane. Passengers were helped down ladders, some hesitating, still processing the near-death experience. Alina remained until the last passengers were safely on the boats and helicopters. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully. Her body shook with the release of adrenaline, her muscles fatigued from the intense control she had exerted. The captain approached, voice heavy with emotion. No one else could have done that. You saved everyone. I don't know how we'll explain this. Alina shook her head. No explanations yet. Focus on safety. After that, the rest can come. The media were already arriving. Distant lights of cameras flickered across the riverbanks, reporters calling out questions, helicopters circling, broadcasting live footage. Alina's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected fame or attention. All she had expected was to survive and keep others alive. As the last passengers were escorted away, a small group lingered, murmuring. One elderly man held his hands together, tears streaking his cheeks. You're a miracle, he said softly. Alina nodded, humbled, but the weight of responsibility lingered. People were safe, but the world would want answers, explanations, and heroes. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. Rescue crews guided her off the plane finally. The cold night air hit her like a wall, snapping her senses back to reality. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but the knowledge of what she had accomplished kept her upright. Cameras swiveled toward her, flashes igniting. Reporters shouted questions she wasn't ready to answer. She moved past them, keeping her focus. Every step forward was calculated, deliberate. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. She needed safety for herself and for those she had saved. But the murmurs followed her, curiosity and awe shadowing every step. Back on the riverbank, paramedics checked her vitals, asked her name, and made sure she was unharmed. She gave them minimal answers, only enough to comply. She watched the passengers, making sure everyone was accounted for. The relief on their faces was almost overwhelming. Some wept openly. Others hugged strangers, the shared trauma bonding them instantly. A helicopter hovered close, preparing to transport a few injured passengers to nearby hospitals. Alina looked at the rotors spinning above, lights cutting through the darkness. She realized then how close they had come to disaster, how fragile life could be. She had stared death in the face at 36,000 feet and walked away. But the weight of that experience pressed down on her now, heavier than any altitude or engine failure. The captain finally spoke again, softly. You're a hero, we all know that, but you're also something else entirely. I've never seen anything like it. Alina allowed herself a faint smile, but it quickly faded. She had done her duty. Recognition would come, yes, but it was secondary. Survival was primary. Nearby, a news crew began live coverage. The anchor's voice rang out over the river, dramatic and urgent. Breaking news tonight. Flight 437, presumed in grave danger, has miraculously landed on a river. Initial reports suggest every passenger survived, miraculously saved by one woman in seat 14C. Who is she? Authorities are scrambling to identify her. Alina's stomach tightened. She hadn't considered this, being thrust into the limelight, the media frenzy, the questions. She had trained for emergencies, for impossible situations, but not for fame, not for scrutiny. Yet she knew it was inevitable. People would want answers. People would want stories. And then a voice called from behind the crowd. "Miss Harper, can we talk to you? The network wants an interview." Cameras swiveled, microphones extended. Reporters pushed forward, eager for a soundbite, a hero narrative. Alina froze. For the first time, uncertainty pierced her armor. She had expected fear, terror, and chaos, but she hadn't expected attention. Not yet. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had saved hundreds of lives, but now, stepping into the world outside the river, she was about to face another storm, one of questions, scrutiny, and curiosity that could change her life forever. And in the background, a distant observer, someone from the airline's corporate office, watched silently, making a note, calculating the implications. Alina had acted outside protocol. She had saved lives, but rules, investigations, and politics were already lining up like shadows behind the moonlight. The crowd surged slightly, the cameras clicked relentlessly, and the river reflected the chaos above. Alina Harper had survived, had saved countless lives, but the true challenge was only beginning. Because what the world didn't yet know, and what she didn't yet fully understand, was that heroism often came with consequences no one could predict. The morning after the miraculous landing, Alina Harper found herself in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room at the Seattle airport. A row of investigators, airline executives, and federal aviation officials faced her, their expressions a mix of astonishment, skepticism, and barely hidden judgment. The weight of their attention pressed down like gravity itself. She had survived the impossible, saved hundreds, but now she had to justify it. The lead investigator, a tall man with steel-rimmed glasses, adjusted his tie and opened a thick folder. "Ms. Harper," he began, voice calm but sharp, "we need a complete account of the events aboard Flight 437. How did you take control of the aircraft, and under what authority?" Alina exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had anticipated questions, but the combination of suspicion and accusation in the room made her stomach twist. "I have the training and experience to handle this," she said, her voice steady. "I assessed the situation, recognized both engines were dead, and took control to prevent catastrophe. I did what needed to be done." A murmur rippled across the room. One of the airline executives leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Training? Ms. Harper, you're a passenger. You had no clearance, no official authorization to operate a commercial airliner. What you did could have violated multiple federal regulations." Alina's jaw tightened. "Yes, technically, but what would you have done if no one acted? Hundreds of lives were on the line. Protocol is meaningless if everyone dies." The lead investigator's gaze narrowed. "We understand the gravity, but rules exist for safety. You circumvented them. That has consequences." Alina held his gaze, unwavering. "Consequences are meaningless if people don't survive. Do you understand what it was like up there? Watching engines fail, feeling the plane drop, knowing every second mattered." Her voice grew quieter but more intense. "I didn't hesitate. I acted." An older executive shook his head, disbelief etched into his face. "You put yourself in danger, yes, but what about the passengers? They could have panicked, destabilized the aircraft. You acted alone. That's reckless." Alina's mind flashed back to the cabin, the fear, the quiet determination, the small hands gripping hers, the way the passengers trusted her in a moment of absolute crisis. They followed instructions because they believed someone was in control, because someone was. One of the investigators cleared his throat, producing a small tablet with images from the rescue operation. "We have video footage of your actions. You were indeed precise, but there are questions about liability. This isn't just about heroism, it's about regulatory compliance, insurance, protocol." Alina felt a flicker of frustration, but she swallowed it. "I understand the regulations, but nothing in protocol prepares you for dual-engine failure over a populated area with no landing strip in reach. I acted to save lives. That's the reality." The lead investigator leaned back, exhaling. "All of this will be documented, but there will be scrutiny. Media, government, the airline, everyone wants answers. And Ms. Harper," his gaze hardened slightly, "there will also be consequences for operating without clearance, no matter the outcome." Alina nodded, expecting this. She had known there would be a storm to follow. "I accept that. But first, the focus should be on the passengers, not bureaucracy." Outside the building, news helicopters hovered, their searchlights sweeping across the airport. Cameras were already rolling live, broadcasting images of emergency vehicles, rescue crews, and most importantly, Alina herself. Her face had become a symbol overnight, a miracle, a hero, a woman who defied odds and laws alike. Social media exploded with clips from the landing. Hashtags trended instantly: "Miracle on the River," "Flight 437 Hero," "Woman in 14C," millions of views within hours. Memes, reactions, speculation, praise, and criticism blended into a chaotic storm of public attention. Alina's phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from friends, strangers, even distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years. Most were praise, some were incredulous questions, and a few were skeptical, questioning her decisions. She silenced it, needing to focus on the investigation and the passengers still recovering from trauma. Meanwhile, airlines scrambled internally. Executives debated whether to embrace the narrative of heroism or suppress it to avoid legal fallout. Investigators prepared reports, analyzing flight data, cockpit recordings, and passenger testimony. Lawyers prepared for potential lawsuits. Alina had inadvertently ignited a media frenzy, and the ripple effect was only beginning. In the hospital, passengers began recounting their experiences, their narratives centering around her. "She saved us," one elderly man whispered repeatedly. "Without her, we wouldn't be here." Each retelling amplified her legend, though Alina herself remained quietly modest. She had acted out of necessity, not for recognition. But even in moments of relative calm, the emotional toll was heavy. Alina replayed the landing in her mind, each second a vivid flashback. The groaning fuselage, the glint of the river, the weight of hundreds of lives in her hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving exhaustion and a raw, lingering tension. Her personal life had already begun to change. News crews sought interviews, airlines wanted statements, and social media demanded instant reactions. She realized, with a mix of apprehension and disbelief, that her world would never be the same. A private woman, sitting quietly in 14C hours ago, had become a public figure, a symbol, a story everyone wanted to claim as their own. That evening, as she sat quietly in a small, dimly lit hotel room, the gravity of her new reality settled in. She watched videos of herself in the cockpit, read messages from passengers, and saw the growing media narrative. Every angle painted her as a hero, a savior, but she felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down like a physical force. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a reporter, microphone in hand, camera crew trailing behind. "Ms. Harper," he said eagerly, "we want your story. The world needs to know, how did you do it?" Alina hesitated, realizing the challenge ahead. Public attention was unavoidable. Every word, every gesture, every detail would be dissected, analyzed, and broadcast. Her story, what she had lived, feared, and acted upon, would no longer be hers alone. She took a deep breath. "I'll tell my story," she said finally, voice steady, "but not tonight. Right now, the people I saved need rest. The attention can wait." The reporter nodded, disappointment flickering briefly before professionalism took over. "Understood, but the world will be watching." Alina closed the door, leaning against it. She had survived dual-engine failure, executed the impossible landing, and kept hundreds alive. But now she faced a new challenge: navigating fame, scrutiny, and the consequences of stepping outside protocol. And in the shadows of her quiet hotel room, she realized one truth she hadn't fully considered. Saving lives was only the first battle. Living with the aftermath would be far more complicated. Outside, the city buzzed with news reports, social media reactions, and a world eager for a hero. Inside, Alina Harper sat alone, exhausted but resolute, knowing that the coming days would test her in ways no cockpit, river, or emergency landing ever could. The hero of Flight 437 had survived the impossible, but the world wasn't finished with her yet. The following morning, Alina Harper found herself surrounded by a whirlwind she hadn't anticipated. Investigators, lawyers, airline executives, and reporters swarmed the hotel lobby, each demanding her attention, explanations, or a statement. The weight of hundreds of lives she had saved hung over her, but so did the heavy mantle of scrutiny. She had been a hero in the air. Now she was a public figure on trial. Her phone vibrated incessantly. Messages from family, friends, strangers, and media outlets blurred together. She silenced it, forcing herself to focus on the immediate reality. The FAA had scheduled a debriefing, and the airline demanded a full account of her actions. Every word she spoke would be recorded, analyzed, and likely twisted for public consumption. A senior FAA investigator entered the room, papers in hand. "Ms. Harper," he said, voice sharp, eyes assessing. "We need a precise timeline. Altitudes, airspeed, glide slope, decisions made. We need to understand exactly what happened, step by step." Alina nodded. She had memorized the sequence perfectly, every decision etched into her mind from simulations and instinct. But recounting it to a room full of skeptical officials, each prepared to criticize her every move, was exhausting. She began her explanation carefully, detailing the dual-engine failure, the glide calculations, the river selection, and the minute-by-minute actions that had prevented disaster. As she spoke, the room grew tense. Questions flew, technical, procedural, and increasingly skeptical. "Why didn't you follow standard emergency protocol?" asked one investigator. "Why did you override the pilots? What if the plane had rolled?" Alina's voice remained steady. "Protocol exists for trained crews." In that moment, the trained crew was incapacitated by limited options. Immediate action was required to prevent hundreds of deaths. Decisions had to be made in seconds. Hesitation would have been fatal. The airline executives exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to rules, risk assessments, and liability. Suddenly, those calculations were secondary to human instinct. Alina had acted outside the box, outside regulations, and yet within the bounds of survival. It was a paradox that threatened to upend their protocols. Meanwhile, news crews were already broadcasting live footage from outside the hotel. Helicopters hovered, cameras zooming in on the entrances and exits, capturing every movement. Social media had exploded overnight, followers doubling, trending hashtags multiplying, and the world was clamoring for a glimpse of the woman who had defied fate. Alina tried to focus, blocking out the cameras, the whispers, the intrusive flashes. She had mastered a crisis at 36,000 feet. She could handle scrutiny, too, she told herself, but the weight of it was undeniable. Every person in the room represented potential judgment, legal complications, or blame, and the world outside was hungry for heroism, scandal, or both. After hours of questioning, one investigator leaned forward, voice quieter now, almost admiring. "Ms. Harper, your decisions were impeccable. By the numbers, you acted perfectly, but you also broke rules. Do you understand the implications?" She nodded slowly. I do, and I accept them. Saving lives is worth more than paperwork, that's the reality. The lead FAA official exhaled. We'll compile our report, but this will be unprecedented. Your actions will be debated, praised, criticized. Legally, you may face consequences, but morally, you did the right thing. Alina allowed herself a brief moment of relief. It was over, at least for now. But the ripple effect had only begun. Social media continued its frenzy, news networks clamored for interviews, and the airline prepared for inevitable public scrutiny. By evening, the public narrative had already formed. News anchors hailed her as a hero, social media was awash with admiration, and ordinary citizens flooded online forums praising her courage and skill. Yet in some corners, criticism brewed. Conspiracy theories, accusations of recklessness, and debates over legality. The story of Flight 437 had become a lightning rod, polarizing audiences in real time. Alina retreated to her hotel room, exhausted and emotionally drained. She replayed the landing over and over in her mind, the groaning fuselage, the narrowing river corridor, the turbulence threatening to capsize them. Each memory was vivid, almost surreal. She had lived the impossible, saved lives, and yet now the impossible was enduring the attention it demanded. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a representative from the airline, clipboard in hand, expression tight. "Ms. Harper, we need to discuss the public statement. Interviews, press releases, the world wants answers." Alina exhaled. "I'm not ready. My priority is the passengers. The media can wait." The representative's brow furrowed. "Understandable, but the narrative is already forming without you. If we don't provide guidance, speculation will dominate. People are already constructing versions of events that may not be accurate." Alina leaned against the doorframe, fatigue pressing down on her. She hadn't sought fame. She hadn't sought recognition. All she had sought was survival for herself, for the passengers, for everyone on Flight 437. And now the world had decided she was a symbol, a hero, a miracle, a subject for debate. That night, she received messages from passengers expressing gratitude, concern, and curiosity. Each note weighed on her, the responsibility of having been entrusted with lives, now amplified by public scrutiny. She responded sparsely, careful not to inflame media speculation. Even her personal life began to fracture under the pressure. Friends reached out with congratulations, yet she felt isolated. Family members expressed awe and fear. And through it all, Alina realized something unsettling. The act of saving lives had shifted the world's perception of her irreversibly. She was no longer just a woman who loved flying. She was a story, a headline, a symbol. The next morning, the FAA released a preliminary statement, cautiously praising her bravery while noting her breach of protocol. Headlines exploded. Passenger saves hundreds, breaks rules in the process. Flight 437 hero, miracle on the river. Alina Harper, hero or rule breaker. Alina read the headlines silently, a mix of pride and apprehension in her chest. She knew the coming days would test her resolve, her patience, and her ability to navigate a world that now demanded her presence, explanation, and persona. And just as she prepared to step out of the hotel, her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Harper." The voice was crisp, professional, and undeniably commanding. "This is the National Transportation Safety Board. We need to speak with you immediately. There are additional questions about the landing and the circumstances leading up to it. Your cooperation is required." Alina swallowed, feeling a shiver of anticipation. The immediate crisis, the landing, was over. But the scrutiny, investigation, and public pressure were just beginning. Her hands tightened around the phone. She had survived the impossible in the air. But could she survive the impossible on the ground, facing a world desperate for answers, heroes, and accountability? Outside, the city pulsed with attention. Helicopters hovered, news vans lined the streets, and social media buzzed relentlessly. The river landing was being dissected, analyzed, and celebrated in real time. Alina stepped forward, a hero to some, a rule-breaker to others, and at that moment acutely aware that the story of Flight 437 was far from over. And in that instant, she realized the truth that would define the next chapter of her life. Saving lives had thrust her into a battlefield far more complex than any cockpit, where the rules were unclear, the stakes high, and every move scrutinized by millions. Alina Harper sat in a small, windowless meeting room at the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the faint murmur of activity in the hall outside. Investigators surrounded her, tablets, charts, and flight data spread before them. The air was thick with anticipation, skepticism, and the quiet tension of judgment. She had survived the impossible landing, but now she faced the impossible questions. "Ms. Harper," began the lead investigator, a sharp-featured man with a clipped voice, "we've reviewed cockpit recordings, flight data, and witness statements. While your actions were extraordinary, there are several anomalies we need explained. Decision-making during dual-engine failure, glide slope choices, river selection. Please clarify your reasoning step by step." Alina exhaled, steadying herself. She had anticipated scrutiny, but the level of detail and the intensity of questioning was overwhelming. Every word could be analyzed, twisted, or misinterpreted. "I followed a logical assessment," she began, voice calm but firm. "Both engines failed. Altitude was insufficient for a conventional landing. I evaluated nearby terrain, identified the river as the only viable option, and executed a glide path to maintain control. All actions were made to maximize survival probability." The investigator leaned forward, voice tight. "You operated without official clearance, a violation of federal aviation regulations. Your decision to override crew authority is unprecedented. We must assess liability and procedural breaches. Do you understand the implications?" Alina nodded slowly. "I understand, but the alternative was catastrophe. Hundreds of lives were at stake. Hesitation would have been fatal." Her gaze was steady, unwavering. The room went silent for a moment. Then a junior investigator piped up. "Did you consider possible structural damage during the river landing? Did you calculate risk to passengers from water impact?" "Yes," Alina replied. "I accounted for fuselage stress, water resistance, and turbulence. Minor impacts occurred, but nothing threatened the integrity of the aircraft. Passenger positioning and bracing instructions mitigated risk further." Her hands rested lightly on the table, but her mind raced. Every detail was critical. Every explanation could shape the final report and potentially her future. Outside, the world waited. News vans lined the streets of Seattle, their satellite feeds broadcasting updates in real time. Social media erupted again, hashtags trending. "Alina Harper, Flight 437 hero, #miracle landing." Analysts dissected every video clip, every interview snippet, speculating on decisions, motives, and outcomes. Fame was no longer optional. It had arrived with a relentless intensity. Meanwhile, airline executives pressured her through phone calls and legal representatives. "We must manage this narrative carefully," one warned. "Every statement you make will be scrutinized. One misstep, and we face lawsuits, public backlash, or regulatory penalties." Alina ignored the calls, focusing instead on the task at hand. Lives had been saved. Now the challenge was to navigate scrutiny without being swallowed by it. Hours passed. Alina repeated her account multiple times, providing minute details about glide slopes, airspeed, turbulence adjustments, and river alignment. Investigators scrutinized her explanations, cross-referencing data and recordings. One questioned her micro-adjustments during turbulence, another analyzed the choice of river section. Each question felt like a calculated probe, designed to test not only her memory but her integrity. By mid-afternoon, the lead investigator leaned back, folding his hands. "Ms. Harper, while your actions were technically in violation of protocol, it's impossible to ignore that hundreds of lives were preserved due to your decision-making. You acted decisively, logically, and with remarkable skill. But public perception is a double-edged sword. The media is framing you as a hero, while legal departments and regulators are questioning every action. This will be complicated. Alina's chest tightened. She had predicted scrutiny, but she hadn't realized how isolating it could feel. She had saved lives, yet the world now dissected her heroism like a case study, every move evaluated, every word weighed. Recognition and judgment existed simultaneously, each as heavy as the other. Later that evening, Alina walked along a quiet riverside path near the site of the landing. The moonlight glimmered on the water, a reflection of what had occurred hours earlier. The river was calm now, but the memory of turbulence, engine failure, and the groaning fuselage pressed on her mind. She traced the path she had taken, each adjustment, each calculation, reliving the tension in vivid detail. Her phone buzzed with another alert. This time it was a trending news segment. Exclusive. Flight 437 hero breaks silence. Alina Harper speaks on miracle landing, the headline read. She clicked cautiously, only to see a reporter narrating dramatized footage of the landing, emphasizing her courage while speculating on regulatory violations and public scrutiny. The world had already taken her story and shaped it into a narrative beyond her control. At the same time, social media comments poured in, some praising her bravery, others questioning her legality, a few maliciously criticizing her decisions. Alina realized the world didn't deal in nuance, it dealt in extremes. Hero or rule breaker, miracle or recklessness, and she was both. The next day a call came from a survivor's family. "Ms. Harper, thank you," a voice said, trembling. "We owe you everything. Our daughter, she's alive because of you." Alina felt a knot tighten in her chest, warmth and sorrow mingling. Saving lives had been immediate, raw, and visceral, but the emotional echoes were long-lasting, far beyond the cockpit, far beyond the river. Back at the FAA office, she faced another round of interviews. Investigators focused on potential procedural errors and liability, cross-examining every choice, every maneuver, every verbal command she had issued in the air. Alina answered carefully, aware that any misstep could escalate into legal consequences. She kept her composure, despite the mounting pressure. By evening, she returned to the hotel, physically drained and emotionally raw. Alone in her room, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The passengers were safe, the impossible had been survived, but the human, social, and professional repercussions were only beginning. Fame, scrutiny, legal review, and media narratives all converged into a maelstrom she hadn't anticipated. Her reflection in the mirror revealed fatigue etched deeply into her face. The woman who had faced death at 36,000 feet was now confronting the death of anonymity, the unrelenting judgment of society, and the fragile morality of heroism under observation. She had been in control up in the air, but on the ground, the currents of law, media, and public perception were far stronger than any turbulence she had faced in flight. And then a final message pinged on her phone, a news alert from a major national network. Flight 437 hero faces FAA investigation. Could heroism lead to legal action? Alina stared at the screen, pulse quickening. The impossible landing had been survived, but the world's response, the legal scrutiny, and the media storm promised a battle that could challenge her in ways no cockpit, river, or engine failure ever could. She exhaled deeply, steel forming in her eyes. Survival had brought her this far, but surviving the aftermath, the public, the authorities, the weight of expectation, would demand more than courage. It would demand resilience she wasn't sure she still possessed. And yet deep inside she knew one thing with certainty. She had faced death once. She could face the world again. Because heroism, she realized, was not measured by landing a plane. It was measured by enduring the storm that followed. The courtroom was packed. Cameras lined the perimeter. Journalists scribbled furiously, and social media feeds streamed live across the globe. Alina Harper stood before the panel of FAA officials, airline executives and legal representatives, her posture calm but resolute. The weight of Flight 437's passengers, the river landing, and the world's gaze pressed down on her shoulders. This was the final stage, the reckoning after the miracle. The lead investigator addressed the room. "Ms. Harper, we've conducted an exhaustive review of your actions. Your decisions, while technically in violation of protocol, saved hundreds of lives. We acknowledge your skill, judgment, and composure under extreme duress. However, federal regulations exist for safety. We must balance recognition with accountability." Alina listened, absorbing each word. She had expected this. Praise and scrutiny would coexist. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, steady, almost serene. She spoke next, voice carrying authority and sincerity. "I understand the necessity of rules, but in that moment there was no time for procedure, only survival. Hundreds of lives depended on immediate action. I made the decisions necessary to prevent catastrophe, and I accept the consequences." A murmur spread across the room. Members of the FAA and airline executives exchanged glances. The tension was palpable, like the silent moments before a storm hits. Outside, the media awaited her every word, the world hanging on every syllable. The panel deliberated briefly, then the lead investigator returned to speak. "After careful review, the board has concluded that Ms. Harper's actions were justified under extraordinary circumstances. While procedural violations occurred, your heroism and technical skill are undeniable. The FAA will issue a formal commendation, and no punitive action will be taken." Relief flooded through Alina, though she remained composed. The judgment was fair, acknowledging her bravery while recognizing the extraordinary situation. The weight of months, adrenaline, scrutiny, media frenzy, lifted slightly from her shoulders. She had survived both the impossible landing and the storm of consequences that followed. Outside the courthouse, the world had already decided her fate. Crowds gathered, holding signs of gratitude, chanting her name. Reporters crowded around her, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Social media exploded anew, millions commenting, sharing, and celebrating the woman who had defied death. She had become a symbol, not just of courage, but of resilience, calm under pressure, and the human capacity to act decisively when lives hang in the balance. Alina stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "I don't need to be called a hero," she said into the microphones, voice steady and clear. "I did what anyone trained and willing would have done. The passengers trusted me, and I acted to preserve that trust. Every life matters and every choice counts." The world listened, captivated. Her words resonated beyond the landing, beyond the headlines, beyond the social media frenzy. They were a reminder that heroism was not performance, it was responsibility. Every person watching felt the gravity of that truth. Later, she visited the families of passengers, small, intimate meetings filled with quiet gratitude. Children ran to her, parents held her hand, elders clasped her shoulder. She saw the relief, awe, and lingering trauma in their eyes. Each interaction reminded her why she had acted, why she had refused to hesitate even when failure seemed inevitable. Back in her apartment that evening, Alina sat alone, reflecting on the journey. The adrenaline had faded. The physical exhaustion was replaced by an emotional exhaustion only the weight of life and death could create. The media would continue to tell her story. The world would continue to speculate, and Flight 437 would become legend. But in the quiet, she found peace in knowing that hundreds were alive because of her courage and skill. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was the first officer of Flight 437 standing nervously, holding a small package. I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "You saved us all. I couldn't speak up back then, I was in shock. But now I just wanted you to know." Alina smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and humility. "You did your part too. We all did. But yes, I'm glad we survived." He handed her the package. Inside was a small plaque engraved with the words, "For courage, composure, and saving 155 lives, Alina Harper, Flight 437." She held it gently, the tangible acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. Tears threatened but did not fall. She had done her duty. Recognition was a quiet bonus, not the goal. As night fell, Alina gazed out her window at the river below, moonlight dancing across its surface. Memories of the landing came unbidden, the glint of water, the shuddering fuselage, the gripping tension of each second. She had stared death in the face and walked away, carrying hundreds of lives with her. Her phone buzzed, a notification. Another news story, another trending hashtag, another replay of the landing. She ignored it. This was no longer about headlines or social media. It was about life, survival, and what it truly meant to act when everything was on the line. For the first time in weeks, Alina felt the adrenaline and fear recede completely. She had faced the impossible in the air and survived. She had faced the impossible on the ground and endured. And she knew, in the depths of her heart, that courage wasn't just about taking control in the cockpit. It was about living with the consequences, standing tall under scrutiny, and holding on to your humanity amid chaos. And yet, even as the river flowed silently beneath the moonlight, Alina understood one truth: the world would never stop testing her. Fame, admiration, judgment, and expectation would follow her forever, but she was ready. She had survived the impossible twice, and the strength to face whatever came next was hers. The river reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, serene and eternal, reminding her that life, fragile and precious, continues even after chaos. She had been a passenger, a pilot, a hero, and now, in the quiet, she was simply Alina Harper, human, resilient, and unbroken. The world outside would continue to watch, to celebrate, to question. But for the first time since the engines had failed, she smiled quietly, knowing she had done what few could and lived to tell the story. And somewhere deep inside, a spark of pride glimmered, not for recognition, not for fame, but for the lives she had saved and the courage she had found within herself when the world seemed poised to fall. Because some stories aren't about survival alone. They're about rising from the impossible, carrying the weight of consequence, and proving that ordinary humans can perform extraordinary miracles.